I am joined now by a friend of mine and almost a guy who comes on at this time every year, whether it be preseason, the SEC Big 12 Challenge, and the SEC Tournament, NCAA Tournament, a guy that almost needs no introduction, Blake Lovell, managing editor of 14 Southeastern. Blake, welcome on the Mitch Davis Show. How you doing? It's been a second since I talked to you.
Yeah, doing well, Mitch. Good talk as always. Thanks for having me on. And, yeah, it's a fun time of year, as we know, and plenty to discuss, I would say.
I wanna just ask you, before we talk about the SEC Big 12 Challenge, before we talk about, Alabama, Kentucky, and all that, I want to ask you about the situation on the outside looking in of the Ole Miss situation, close to me. What is your takeaways from that, and what happens next for Ole Miss?
Yeah, I mean, like probably others do. I mean, I'm a Kermit Davis guy because obviously, being from Nashville and seeing what he did at MTSU, there for a while and just kind of, understanding, getting that program to a level that really just, had not been to before in terms of their overall success, their tournament success, and those kind of things. And, came into this job, felt like it was certainly a nice fit. I mean, got into the tournament year one, and since then, I think it's just been, a combination of things, right? I mean, look, you can't ignore the injury situation. I mean, this is a team that's just been hit by injuries over the past several years. Last year was just on a completely different level, I think, when you looked at just how many injuries they had. But, this season they're 1-7 in the league. And quite frankly, when you look at their upcoming schedule, you're wondering where those wins are going to come from. And you look at kind of where the rest of the league is now, and this is kind of an interesting spot, right? Because you had so many coaching changes in the offseason. You have programs that are kind of not starting over because, again, it's a transfer era. Everyone starts over after every season, it seems like. But, yeah, they're not getting it done. And I think that's, certainly something you understand in this business. You have to win games. And, it just is not – it's not gone the way they wanted to there in terms of being able to, I think, build a consistent team year after year. Not get hit, transfers and injuries and all those kind of things that everyone else has to deal with too. But it seems like for Ole Miss specifically, injuries in the past couple seasons, right now, they're without Matthew Morrell, and which I think he may be back for the Oklahoma State game. But, it is one of those things where I just don't think they've had that consistency. And certainly that's just led to them just kind of being, another team in the SEC until this year where it feels like it's kind of hit an extreme where they just cannot find a way to break through. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Like I said, I just think that at some point, you do understand that this is a business where winning matters most, and especially in the SEC where everything, as you know, Mitch, it's like the stakes are as high as they've ever been from the standpoint of people wanting to win and the money that can go into trying to win and those kind of things. So we'll see what happens, but it's certainly not the best season to this point, without question, for the Rebels.
I think the elephant in the room, and obviously, Blake, you've been around this longer than I have, but elephant in the room is likely Ole Miss is going to go through a coaching change at the end of the season, barring a miracle. When that does happen, or if it does happen, who are those guys that, if you were Ole Miss, if you were Keith Carter, the athletics director, who do you call?
Well, I think that's always an interesting discussion because I think for most teams at this point, you can go two ways. You can go for another power conference coach, or you can go for the rising, mid-major coach out there. And I think when you look at it from Ole Miss's standpoint, they can probably go in a variety of different ways, whether, just depending on, look, could you start at the top and try to find a power conference coach maybe that wants to get out of a situation, wants to come to the SEC, those kind of things? Absolutely. But I think what you also have to keep in mind, and this, I don't think the Ole Miss job is very high on the list when it comes to SEC jobs in terms of just attractive jobs nationally. I don't think it's very high up there. And, again, that's not to say you can't get a good coach, but I just don't think it is. And I think that there, are obviously things that, you're right, maybe that's Kermit Davis, that's part of it. They're just things where maybe they're just not able to kind of get that level of player every single season that they need to be able to keep up with all the other teams. And maybe that's part of it. I'm sure it is. But at the same time, there's someone out there, as you know, Mitch, that if this happens and they do have a change or something, somebody out there wants a raise. And they're probably going to you'll have an opportunity to get paid a lot of money at Ole Miss if someone new comes in. And, then that's where I think you start looking at the mid-major guys, the guys who are going to come up in all of these, I think, any kind of power conference jobs that are changed. Pat Kelsey's name's going to come up everywhere. You know that. Bob Ritchie's name at Furman, he's going to, be all over the place. He's someone that's just kind of always been in that discussion, as we know. And look what he's done at Furman. He's just done a great job. So I think that's probably, again, barring just us not being able to predict which power conference guy maybe wants out and wants to go to another power conference. Those are always tricky because I think it's hard to predict those switches that can happen. But I think from just a mid-major level, those are obviously, I think, the sort of the top names you're going to see out there just because of the success they've had. I think Dusty May at Florida Atlantic's another one to really keep an eye on, former SEC assistant with Florida, with Mike White. And, that's an interesting one. I think really, if you're trying to connect a lot of dots, I think he would be a great choice if he's an option there, because I do think, look at what he's done this season. Florida Atlantic's 19-1. And of course, it's kind of ironic, isn't it, Mitch? Because their only loss is who? It's at Ole Miss. So it's kind of one of those things that I think I would keep an eye on those three names specifically: Pat Kelsey, Bob Ritchie, Dusty May. I think they're going to get a lot of attention. Elsewhere, we could probably bat around a lot of names, couldn't we? It's like there's a lot of guys out there that could probably fit the criteria, but I think it's always just a question of, okay, are you able to lure another power conference guy over, or are you just going to go the route of, kind of going and get the rising mid-major type guy? So a lot of names out there, I think, on both levels. So
I want to ask you one more guy before we move on from this, but I want to ask you about Casey Alexander. Obviously at Belmont, has done wonders at Belmont. If that opportunity arose for Casey Alexander, do you think that would be a lateral move for him from leaving a mid-major powerhouse at Belmont to go to a subpar SEC program?
I think Casey's an interesting example because, he is at Belmont, and that's what he's known, right, outside of being at Lipscomb. He's a Rick Byrd, disciple, and just knowing kind of, I think that's always an interesting question because you think about it, it's like, okay, well, what happens if I leave Belmont? Then it's like, what happens to the legacy of Belmont? And you're talking about someone that's so ingrained in that school, and I think it's going to take something, I think, really special to lure him away from that, knowing that he was kind of chosen as the guy to carry on the legacy, right, of what Rick Byrd did, and I think you want to be able to protect that a bit. And I think it's also interesting to always think about, like, Casey Alexander's only 50 years old, and I feel like Casey's been around forever. Just kind of, knowing him as an assistant, he's there for so many years as an assistant. Obviously played there, but he's still only 50, and he's just. I think he's someone he's going to get those opportunities. And I can honestly say I wouldn't be. I know he's gotten those calls before. It's just a matter of how far do those calls go. And I think that's always kind of an interesting one to think about. But Casey's one that popped up in the Vanderbilt search. For reasons that would, again, obviously make sense from a geographical standpoint, from a stylistic standpoint. But, I always think that's one that you just have to maybe dig a little deeper on because, again, it's like Casey knows if he leaves, he's leaving Belmont out there, perhaps with a coaching search, and who knows, who gets hired. Or maybe if it's one where, hey, maybe I want to make this move, but I also want to make it clear, like, maybe this guy should get the job and kind of, maybe push it in that way and do those kind of things. But, something else, Mitch, too, it's like Belmont's now in the Missouri Valley, which is a much better situation than they're in the OPC. So a lot of things in play there. He's a really good coach, but, maybe more complicated than you would think with him in terms of maybe wanting to leave Belmont.
One more coaching question, not about Ole Miss, but I want to ask you about the elephant in the room in the SEC. John Calipari, 2 weeks ago, rumors were swirling. Kentucky had just lost to South Carolina. Everybody was saying he was going to Texas. What are you hearing about that? And are you buying any of that?
Well, I always said from the start. The thing with Texas is that they have the resources to do things that would at least make someone consider it that maybe you never would think would consider it, right? But when you combine the two together, it's understandable why we all started talking about that. Because you're like, well, he just lost to South Carolina, who is historically going to have a historically bad SEC season. Like they are on that road. Like Georgia last year was bad, but if you actually look at the statistics, the South Carolina team may actually be worse than a Georgia team that only won 6 games last year, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of something interesting to think about there, because then everything changed. And at that point, we had those discussions. It felt like you could connect the dots and say, well, Texas needs a coach. John Calipari may be getting run out of Kentucky, but look what they've done since then. And I think I said, look, from the start, you can never discount anything when you have Texas money and resources, and maybe not knowing exactly the motivation behind a coach at a certain point in his career. But I think with Cal, it was always going to be tricky to say, well, he's headed to Texas because why? Next season, Cal has, we talk about historically, I mean, even in Kentucky context, right? Yeah. This is a tremendous class that he has coming in next year. It is the type of class that can completely, perhaps rejuvenate him as a coach. It can completely change the dynamic of the program because, once again, I'd be shocked if they don't come into next season ranked number 1 or number 2 in the country, just given the class they have coming in. And so when you combine those things together, unless Kentucky's running him out of town, which they're not at this point, I can't see him leaving knowing he has that class in place next season. Now, sure, he could, right, Mitch, he could pitch up. He could just pick up and take them all with him. But, that's a little bit more complicated than he makes it seem sometimes in the transfer era. But I just think I dubbed it as the revenge tour next season. It's like, but it looks like the revenge tour has already started because of how they're starting to play now. And if they get a win against Kansas on Saturday, look out. Like Kentucky, yeah. I thought they were back after they beat Vanderbilt just because they got their confidence and their swagger back. But they beat Kansas. That takes it to another level. So I don't think Cal's going anywhere. I think it was understandable to have those discussions after the South Carolina game because that was, in all honesty, that was one of the most surprising SEC outcomes probably in a decade. Yeah. Not because Kentucky had been perfect at that point, but just because South Carolina had been sort of that bad. Yeah. And so it is kind of a wild thing to think about, but Cal's not going anywhere at this point.
Let me ask you one more question about Cal. We're going to talk SEC Big 12 Challenge. Have you heard the same things that have been reported from Matt Jones from Kentucky Sports Radio about the toxic relationship with Calipari and Mitch Barnhart and the boosters there at University of Kentucky?
Yeah, it's all the football stuff, right? That was, when you have your basketball coach and your football coach like publicly sparring, that's never a good thing.
Yeah.
Especially in Kentucky, I feel like. It's like of all the places, boy, that gets very complicated if it happens in Kentucky. And, the whole stuff with Cal and Stoops and, Barnhart publicly backing one or the other or privately, whichever way you want to put it. It got weird. Let's call it what it is. The optics for that were not good. Yeah. And I think that is something to certainly think about because, you did see, like you said, the reports, and I know Kyle Tucker in The Athletic had something out there maybe about, Cal had pitched some ideas in terms of resources that maybe Kentucky was not exactly addressing at this point or something along those lines. And, I think that's always something that can come into play, and that's why, like I said, you don't know what a guy's motivation could be. And so we can sit here and say Cal's not going anywhere, but it's like, well, what if that relationship is one of those little factors that all of a sudden becomes a big factor? And he's like, well, you know what? I am going to take all my guys with me, and I'm going to go to wherever, Texas or somewhere else, and I'm going to show you, right? That's also something you can do as a competitive coach at the D1 level. And I think that's always something to think about in this scenario. And there's stuff we don't know, about their relationship and stuff behind the scenes, I'm sure. And but I think just from what we see on the outside, the whole thing that with Cal and Stoops probably did, impact some relationships there in one way or the other, and how that's changed or what has or hasn't changed, I guess we don't really know the answer for sure.
I will say this, Blake, on the record, as a Kentucky fan, the full football basketball argument has gone on for 65 years, and it's ugly. It's an ugly black eye for our university. But Blake, nothing negative talk. SEC Big 12 Challenge, Kentucky, Kansas. Let's talk about that game first. What do you expect to see, and how big would they win for Kentucky be over Kansas?
Yeah, it would be huge because it's like, well, you think Kentucky's back, but it's like if you add another one, you really can kind of cement that. And it's a team that's won at Tennessee. I said they won at Vanderbilt, and people say, well, it was just Vanderbilt. But I think it was how they won at Vanderbilt, how they beat Texas A&M, who, by the way, I don't know why people are not jumping on the bandwagon just yet. A&M is a really, really good team. They were in December. They are now. And I think sometimes we use that against teams, which you can say the same for Kentucky, right? We do kind of use that against them, how bad they were in big games, leading up to the South Carolina debacle. But now they win at Tennessee. A&M was a big game. This is a bigger game against Kansas, a team that, you're talking about, by the way, with Kansas got a 3-game losing streak right now. Yeah. If they lose in Kentucky, it goes to 4. But it's not just that. Then they got to come home and play Kansas State. They go to Iowa State. They're home against Texas. Those are the 3 games after that. I'm not saying Kansas is going to be on a 7-game losing streak. But, is it completely out of the question that could happen? I don't think so. Yeah. Because that's a tough slate that they've got. In the Big 12, let's call it what it is. They're the best conference in the country. And I think this is the challenge against this Kentucky team at Rupp because, that's what we say, right? That's another reason why the South Carolina game was just so mind-boggling because it happened at Rupp. If it happens in Columbia, maybe you change your opinion a little bit. But it happened at Rupp. That doesn't happen there. And I think this is one where Kentucky's the home team here. You remember, Mitch, look what Kentucky did to Kansas last season. Yeah. 2 different teams, of course. But go on the road, just throttled them. And Kansas probably looking for some revenge here, but this is just a Kansas team that's not playing well right now. They're not playing well specifically on the offensive end of the floor. They're not doing some things great on the defensive end of the floor. Meanwhile, it feels like Kentucky has found their rhythm on both sides of the floor, which, again, is a scary thought, especially offensively, now that Casey Wallace has the ball in his hand as much as he does. And Oscar Tshiebwe, we know, at any time can go off for 30 and 20. And so I think this is one of those games where it feels like Kentucky's got all the momentum. It feels like Kansas is kind of going in the opposite direction. Sometimes that stuff can correct itself, especially when you're talking about the defending national champion in Kansas. But I would find it hard to pick against Kentucky here. I just think, again, these are 2 teams recently that seem to be heading in opposite directions, and it looks like the Cats have kind of got their groove back. So
I want to ask you about Alabama and Oklahoma. Obviously, you and I've been reading your stuff, reading your tweets. You and I are very high on Alabama. That's my national champion pick as of right now. Talk about this matchup, and how excited are you just to watch Alabama basketball right now?
Yeah, Alabama's certainly very entertaining, and, like you mentioned earlier, they had that game against Mississippi State. It didn't look great, but let's be honest. That's their first 7 SEC games before that. They won every single one of them by double digits, including beating Mississippi State on the road. And they've now, in every SEC game, they haven't allowed more than 69 points in a game. And it's like, there's your difference in Alabama. Everyone wants to talk about the offense, which is fun to do, because they're great on offense when they want to be. Brandon Miller is one of the best players in the country. And that's fun to talk about, because those are the exciting things. But what's really exciting is that they are so good on the defensive end. And I know that, it's not always the most sexy thing is to just talk about defense. But the reason why Alabama is where they are is because they're as good as they are defensively. And probably because they got Brandon Miller. That helps too. But it's like, you think about that team last year, and the team last year lacked a lot of things. They didn't lack offense. They didn't shoot as well. But they didn't lack offense. But they lacked, I think, any sort of consistency defensively. We saw that. They lack the chemistry, and they lack sort of just those intangibles you need to be a national championship type team. Yeah. I think Alabama's got all those things on this team. They've got all the things they lacked last season, and that's why they're so confident right now. That's why they're playing as well as they are. And you look at this Oklahoma team, again, something to always keep in mind, Mitch, you know this. Oklahoma's 2-6 in the Big 12, but in the Big 12, being 2-6 is actually not that bad because that is just a brutal conference, and they've had a brutal schedule to this point. I still think this is a pretty good team, but if you're asking me if I think they can keep up with Alabama, it's all about tempo. Oklahoma wants to play a completely different style, and they're going to turn the ball over a little bit. Alabama doesn't force a lot of turnovers. Neither one of these teams force a lot of turnovers. So I think Oklahoma's got to dictate the pace, make Alabama play in the half court. But even when you do that, I just feel like it's a hard ask to beat this Alabama team. So, yeah, I think the Tide should be in a pretty good spot, and maybe that Mississippi State game is one that gets your attention a little bit, and you kind of regroup and refocus and play Oklahoma for what I feel like is the 90th time in this SEC Big 12 Challenge. Surely they're not going to play again since the challenge is over, but, I feel like these two teams play every year. But I think Alabama probably gets the nod in this one.
That's the same thing with Kentucky-Kansas. I feel like every year we have this challenge, it's been Kentucky-Kansas. I know Kentucky's played Texas, Texas Tech, but every year it feels like it's been Kansas. So, but Blake, I got 3 more games I want to ask you about. Obviously, there's others, but 3 games that really just stand out to me. Obviously, TCU travels to Starkville, a game that you and I were talking looks like an upset could happen down there at the Hump. What do you expect to see out of Mississippi State on Saturday?
I have no idea, Mitch, and that's why people are going to think I'm crazy for picking Mississippi State as an upset. But I did do that in our official predictions video. There's a spoiler. I don't know why I did, to be honest with you, and I know that's like, why did you do it? Well, it's a feel thing more than anything, probably. You know how hard it is for teams to come into there and start going, not win, but play great. I think that's probably the better way to put it.
Yeah.
You know, Tennessee won there, Alabama won there. I don't know that either team just was great, but they had enough because of why? Because Mississippi State just can't score. And that would worry me a little bit about TCU here. You know, because TCU is good defensively. And, you know, they may come in here and shut Mississippi State down just like everybody else has. But I also think Mississippi State does enough on the defensive end of the floor to probably make this game interesting. And that's why I said, you got to pick upset somewhere, right? It can't be boring. And that's what I told Chris. I was like, Chris, come on, we got to pick an upset somewhere. And I think maybe Missouri, Iowa State's the better choice of the group. Although I said I don't really think Kentucky beating Kansas would be an upset in my opinion right now. Maybe it winds up being from the better standpoint, but this one would be an upset for me because I just look at the way TCU has played. I mean, you talk about a team that they got a lot of pieces, and Jamie Dixon's always been a guy I think has never gotten the credit he deserves for being one of the best out there. They got a lot of good wins this year. They got some close losses. Mississippi State, if you look at their offensive numbers, it'll make your head explode sometimes because it's like, you know, effective field goal percentage, 340th nationally, 3-point percentage, 354th nationally, free throw percentage, 355th nationally. They are so bad in so many offensive areas. But for some reason, I just get the sense that they come out in a game here and maybe have a shot at winning this one. So that's my long shot for the weekend, Mitch. I'm not telling anybody to run out there and put money on it, but for some reason I think Mississippi State maybe has a chance to build off of that performance in Alabama and come back home and play a 50-48 game here and get a win maybe.
Look, Blake, I'm right there with you. I said they would beat Alabama the other night. People thought I was crazy. They almost did it. I'm still staying with State on Saturday until they prove me wrong. But Blake, 2 more games I want to ask you about. Arkansas travels to Waco to take on a good Baylor team. Matchup-wise, I've been excited about this matchup for about a year now. What do you expect to see out of this game? Can the Hogs go into Waco and get a massive win?
Well, I mean, I feel a lot better about that if Nick Smith was playing because I just think Arkansas right now, I feel like offensively, you know, they have to adjust their rotation so much because, you know, they don't have Nick Smith, they don't have Kevin Brazile, of course, who's out for the season. And I just think that's made them play much different. Now, they can still defend, which I feel like we could just put that on loop when we're talking about SEC teams, right? It's just that they can all defend. But, man, I don't know how you can have a confidence in them going in and winning this game against Baylor, who has seemingly turned it around. You know, they started 0-3 in Big 12 play. Now they won 5 in a row. As confident as ever. And, you know, think about that too, right? Like 2 of their Big 12 losses were by a point to TCU, lost by 2 in overtime to Kansas State. So it's like, this is still an elite, you know, team. I mean, you know, we kind of expect Scott Drew's teams, but I worry for Arkansas in a game like this. Baylor can get to the free throw line a little bit, as we know. And I just like, if Arkansas gets in foul trouble, that rotation, you're relying on some guys right now that I think, you know, at full strength, they're probably not playing a lot of minutes, but you're having to play these guys. And not to say that, you know, some of these guys can't contribute. We're seeing that. Like Joseph Pinion can come in and knock down 2 threes in a minute and change the game for you. But at the same time, you know, it's just kind of, it stretches, I think, your limitations in terms of offense. Like you just kind of, you have a little bit more, you're a little more limited maybe in terms of how you adjust your rotation. This is one of those games where, you know, Baylor's what does Baylor always do? Baylor's a good offensive rebounding team. They get some second chance opportunities. I feel like this is one of those games where Arkansas does not rebound the ball well, which they've been good at times, I think. then they could be in trouble. And remember, Arkansas is not a great three-point shooting team. That worries me a little bit too on the road. So I tend to think Baylor is probably the choice here.
Blake, we got a massive game on Rocky Top, and I hate to use that word massive, but it really is. You got the Rick Barnes championship game, Texas, Tennessee. What do you expect to see out of this game? Does Tennessee come away with a win?
Yeah, the old Barnes Bowl here. It's like we've been waiting on this one for a while, haven't we? Every year in the Big 12 SEC, you're like, when are they going to play? You know they're going to play something. And so we finally were getting this, of course, after that game last year was just like, oh, you're like, well, we finally got it, but it's, well, I'm not sure we wanted to get it, because that was that game. It was like 50 to 51, I don't know, it's 51-50, something like that, 52-51 maybe in Texas. That was a defensive slugfest. But we get it again, and I'm glad it's in Knoxville because, this is kind of one where, hey, you look at both these teams, they're both really good. Look at what Rodney Terry's done. Obviously, the whole Chris Beard situation, but Rodney Terry's done a great job there with that team. Again, navigating what has been certainly a tricky situation when you think about kind of where, how everything unfolded and all that. But give him a lot of credit. I think he should absolutely be in the running to get that job based on what they're doing. But what do we say about Tennessee? They are on another level defensively than everybody else. And maybe put Houston there because you know how Houston plays. But I think Tennessee, statistically, is on a different level than a lot of these teams. And, I mean, they have just – when you really look at the stat, Mitch, it's crazy to think how many times they've given up less than 60 points this season. Like, it is just an unbelievable feat for this team on it. And here's the problem for everybody out there that has to play Tennessee. They have gotten healthy, it seems.
Yes.
You knock on wood when you say that. But, like, it feels like they've gotten their whole group back now. And, kind of saw that against Georgia the other night. And I think that's a problem for everybody, Alabama included.
Yeah.
I just think Tennessee, when they're on defensively, you cannot score against them. And the only thing you're always going to hesitate about, of course, the Kentucky game gave us that point back, where it's like just when you think Tennessee's turning the corner offensively, what happens? They have just a complete, stinker of a game where they miss every layup in sight and can't hit a shot. That's always in the back of your mind. And against Texas, that's something that can pop up. You know how they like to play from a style standpoint. Texas is a good team offensively. That's a good rotation they've got. But I trust Tennessee more right now. And maybe you don't want to get too strong on the trust on the offensive end of the floor, but because they've got everybody back, I think Josiah Jordan-James is such a difference maker. Having him back has been huge. Ziegler, Vescovy, everybody's contributing, and they're doing something for this team. And that's why I think Tennessee is, we always say this, I feel like, with some of these teams, not every team, but like their Final Four good, and you can hesitate and say, well, Barnes can't win a March and all this other stuff, but man, this team is so good on defense, I'd put them up against anybody right now, so I would probably pick them against Texas.
Before we even get off here, Blake, I will say I said this was the best Tennessee team that Barnes has ever had. And people have called me crazy, people have called me stupid. I stand by that. I stand by the fact that this is the best Tennessee team that I've seen in years. It really is. They're just a complete team. They're not the most talented guys on the floor, but they play as a complete unit. And that's a difference maker. You look at the national champions over the last 10 years, what do all they have in common? They have 5 stars, but they also have 3 and 4 stars that play as a team. And that's what Tennessee has right now. But Blake, tell them where they can find all your amazing work. I appreciate you coming on. I'm going to have you back on in a few weeks as we get ready for the SEC tournament.
Yeah, no, you got it, my friend. Appreciate you having me on. Like you said, southeastern14.com. You can find our stuff there. If you want to go on YouTube, that's probably the best place to find it. Search for Southeastern 14. Subscribe there. We have daily SEC basketball videos going up, all daily SEC football. We have daily SEC baseball. So we got it all covered. Lots of videos every day, multiple videos going up on our channel. So you can check that out there, and everything else, you can follow me on Twitter at @DPlayFootball.